Good morning. My name is Ada Skiles, and I'm the Associate Director of Chapin Hall Center for Children at the University of Chicago. On behalf of Chapin Hall, I'd like to welcome you to our Child and Family Policy Forum. We would like to thank those of you who are here in person and those joining us on our live webcast for taking the time to be with us today. Today's program is entitled, How Do We Promote Stability and Self-Sufficiency for Low-Income Families with Safety Net Programs? I know you will find today's conversation both lively and informative. Moderating our panel of experts on this topic is Chapin Hall's Executive Director, Brian Samuels. Again, thank you very much for participating in today's program with us, and I'll now turn the program over to Brian, who will introduce our panel to you. Thank you.
Great, and thanks, Ada. Again, I'm Brian Samuels, Executive Director of Chapin Hall. This is an exciting topic. It's a topic that Chapin Hall is very committed to, and we've got a wonderful panel here. So AJ Chaudhry is here. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for HHS in Washington, D.C. We were colleagues for 4.5 years and a great friend. In addition to him, we have Bob Gerger, who is a senior researcher at Chapin Hall, and Heather Hill, who is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, Chicago School of Social Service Administration. So we have a really impressive group. More importantly, they've got lots to say, and so we're going to let them make some introductory presentations, and then we'll take questions from the audience as well as those who have joined us online. So AJ. Whichever you're comfortable.
Okay, great. Good morning. Hello, Chicago. I want to thank you, Brian, and Chapin Hall for including me as part of today's program. As Brian said, until last fall, Brian Samuels and I were close working colleagues in the federal government and in the Obama administration, where Brian was a leading voice and champion for services and systems to support the nation's most vulnerable children and families. He continues to be a champion for America's children, and his taking the helm at Chapin Hall represents a fantastic gain for Chicago and a loss for the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families, where he served admirably as commissioner. As Brian said, I am the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Services Policy at HHS, where I work in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, also called ASPE. ASPE serves as the principal advisor to the HHS Secretary on policy development and is responsible for major activities in policy coordination, legislative development, strategic planning, policy research, evaluation, and economic analysis. As Brian mentioned, there could not be a more timely and important area for a national conversation than family self-sufficiency, and as well as economic inequality and how instability affect family self-sufficiency. As President Obama said last month in a speech in Washington, the issues posed by the unremitting, decades-long growth in economic inequality and the diminished opportunities for economic mobility is the defining challenge of our time and the focus of his second term in office. In the few minutes I have, I want to be sure to address a few points. So I put them up here on the slide. First is a question I've been struggling with, which is, what do we mean by family self-sufficiency for families in today's economic and social contexts? I've been thinking about that term, self-sufficiency, since Chapin Hall suggested this forum. What do we mean by it? How is it used? In thinking about it, I want to suggest that in some ways it's a misnomer. It's very hard to specify. It means different things to different people. And in some ways is used more rhetorically then is easily applicable for analysis. I'll suggest what after thinking about it, I took away as an applicable analysis, and that's what I'll follow up on. If we start with the definition offered for discussion in the topic description this morning, which is when families are able to make ends meet, are self-reliant, or no longer require the support of government programs. As one starting point for how to conceptualize the term, then the analyst in me asks, okay, how many families could be then considered, quote, self-sufficient? And if we take a strict view of not requiring any government program support, but yet being able to meet the family's basic needs by contemporary standards for human sustenance, development, dignity, providing a living for themselves and their families, one confronts immediately a fundamental challenge, which is that it's not practical for a great many families, given the current labor market context of very low wage jobs, very significant employment and income instability, and limited opportunities for achieving economic mobility. I'll touch on a couple of these quickly. As a great many contemporary labor economists have shown, family income for all but the top third of earners have been frozen in place since the 1970s. Real median earnings for families with children in the US for 2012 was about $60,000. And it was $59,000 in 1979, when income inequality started climbing over the third of the century that has followed. For male full-time year-round workers, median income actually declined some over this period, about $1,000, from $50,000 to about $49,000. And while median income for female full-time full-year workers increased from $30,000 to $38,000, women's earnings still amount to only 79% of males' full-time full-year earnings. It's hard to say that if half the country has those as their take-home income, I mean not their take-home income, their full income, that self-sufficiency is easily achieved. The nation's economic output, it's not as though the country wasn't making money during this period. The nation's economic output has more than doubled in that time. But national income has been skewed. The gains have been largely concentrated at the top of the income distribution, mostly among the top 10%. The top 10% share of national income went from taking 1/3 of national income in 1979 to 1/2 by 2012. When one considers how most parents think about and most importantly pursue what they might consider self-sufficiency, they're probably thinking a little bit more realistically and strategically, and not necessarily rhetorically, about what's meant by that. We as parents seek to maximize the family's total resources through working pretty much every day for their family's living, but they do this through a combination of employment together with any financial and in-kind supports that they're able to achieve. And this has been the case for a very long time. So back before welfare reform, scholars Catherine Eden and Laura Lane, in what's now a landmark study, asked a couple of simple questions that weren't so simple to answer. Well, how do single mothers on welfare survive and provide for their children on very meager welfare income? And they also asked, how do women who work low-wage, sporadic employment manage to provide for their families? Kathy actually began this work right here in Chicago when it was her dissertation study, in which actually she has one of the best names ever for a dissertation. There's a lot of month left at the end of the check, which was to say that no one support was able to provide enough. So what did she find? Well, she found, in fact, that most did not do either of those things. Most families, most mothers were combining private and public supports to maximize whatever they could get to establish a living standard for their families. Most parents today do the same thing. Most parents today work, and many who would want to achieve self-sufficiency through their labors alone also rely on what we consider safety net resources. Many of these public benefits have been established with the expectation that they reward and support work and to encourage greater degrees of self-sufficiency by families. This leads me to think of self-sufficiency not as an either-or continuum, a status one is in or is not, but best viewed as a continuum where families are more or less self-sufficient, and that over time, families seek to become more self-sufficient. All of my points are that I wanted to walk through that thinking, and I'll make a couple of other points quickly and then show you a couple of slides. The second point is there's a compounding challenge, not just of insufficient income through earnings alone, but the issue of instability for achieving self-sufficiency. As already indicated, family self-sufficiency is a challenge and a struggle for a broad range of low and moderate income families. My colleague Heather Sandstrom at the Urban Institute has recently done a brilliant research synthesis that looks at the effects of instability on child development and academic outcomes, looking across various research domains, particularly in 5 areas: economic, employment, family composition, housing, and out-of-home childcare settings, all of which are inherently unstable for low-income families, but all of which compound one another and compound the ability to achieve self-sufficiency. The third quick point I wanted to make is about some research we're doing at ASPE, which is Chris Weimer, one of our researchers, has been doing some fairly brilliant analysis of what's called the supplemental poverty measure, which is a useful adaptation of a new poverty measure that has been reported the last few years by the Census Bureau that allows us to better understand how federal benefits such as the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, help lift families out of poverty and how this has looked over the last dozen years or so. For those who are not familiar with it, it's useful because unlike the traditional official poverty measure, it accounts for the relative prices of basic goods and services that families need to survive. It varies by geographic region, so the price of things in Chicago is not the same as the price of things in Omaha. It takes into account people's living situations more accurately, so it includes foster children, for example, as residents of households and their income together with their caregivers. It counts unmarried cohabiting parents. And finally, most importantly for what I want to show you today, SPM considers a variety of resources beyond traditional pre-tax cash income, such as housing, recognizing that measuring families' well-being, self-sufficiency, poverty, whatever you want to measure, requires taking a full picture and not separating out private earnings from work from the other resources that families rely on. So so I want to argue that it's actually a useful tool for this conversation and for looking at how families combine both work and safety net supports. So I'm probably going to go over a couple of minutes if that's all right. But I'll walk through these very quickly. So this slide here, so this Chris Weimer developed that shows how families combine earnings with employment and safety nets to make their ends meet. This figure shows median family earnings for all families with children across the income distribution. Starting at the bottom with incomes between about $0 and $12,000 per year, there's 14% of families are in that bottom group. And the median earnings among that group is $9. That means that about half of them earn 0. And I'll come back to that group to make a couple points maybe in the Q&A session. But as you proceed upward, you see that the top group, which is about a little bit more than a third of the families, have a median income of $115,000 or above 300% of poverty. That group starts at about 70,000. And what you can see here is, one, that many of these groups probably do not earn enough through work alone to achieve modicum of what would be considered self-sufficiency. In fact, about half the distribution is below 200% of poverty, and that group we'll see in a second, relies on both earnings and safety net supports to get by. There's also, what you can see from here is, these are all families. So except for the bottom group, all families pretty much have earnings, right? So over 90% of families have parents who are deriving earnings to support their families. Now the second slide shows you the degree to which a family relies on any safety net benefit. And what you can see here is a really clear stepwise progression moving up the income distribution, that below 100% of poverty, between 80 and 90% of families are relying on at least one safety net program. And this includes SNAP, TANF, WIC, school lunch, Medicaid, or housing assistance. And if you look at between 100 and 200% of poverty, over 50% are still relying on benefits to get by. And then even between 200 and 300%, a quarter to a third, still receive some assistance. Overall, nearly half, 46% of families receive some safety net benefits. So under that strict definition, if you were to say just receive no safety net benefits, and then you would find that nearly half of the US population is, quote, not self-sufficient. Now if you look at what the median level of those benefits, again, you see a very clear stepwise progression upwards, where families in the lowest income group, between 0 and 50%, receive, the median family receives about $7,500 in the safety net benefits that were included on the last slide, which, as I indicated, are SNAP, school lunch, WIC, cash welfare, SSI, and housing assistance. So they receive the largest, and then when the lighter bar right above it shows you what they receive when you add the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which itself is meant to be a wage supplement, so whether you count that as, quote, self-sufficient or not, it still shows that, still shows the stepwise progression, but you notice that above 50% of poverty, the EITC is the largest source of funding for all families above that level in terms of support. These are for families who receive the benefits. So I think, taken together, these slides show that a majority of families are working. Many have earnings that provide only a low income. A very large share of families combine work and safety net benefits, with about half getting some degree of support from public benefit programs. Note, these levels should be interpreted with the view of these are static one-year measures. Actually, families who don't achieve self-sufficiency are probably greater because there's a lot of movement, even among those who, let's say, are above 200% in this graph, and so it affects, it likely affects a majority of Americans. So the couple of last quick points I just want to make is President Obama is leading efforts to try to promote self-sufficiency and to address poverty and inequality. As I've already said, he made a major address to the nation on December 4th, which if you didn't hear, I would commend you to listen to, on economic mobility. And as he put it, the economy has become profoundly unequal and families are more insecure. I would add to that achieving self-sufficiency has become more of a distant reach. The profound degree of inequality that has grown nearly inexorably over close to 4 decades limits and harms the economy and its potential for growth. As he put it, it's bad for families, it's bad for democracy and social cohesion. His administration assumed the reins of governing when the US economy was in a free fall. That was not seen for the better part of anyone's lifetime. And the president's first order of business was to make the case that the role of government in helping to ameliorate as much of the harm visited on families and workers struggling to get by. And though they were the lowest income families were also the ones who bore the greatest brunt of the economic downturn. The American Recovery Act was actually an extraordinary effort that bolstered the safety net and made it more efficient and reached more families than in any other time in our history. And I would argue it worked to relieve and limit suffering at a remarkable and unprecedented level. It did not turn the forces of inequality back, nor could it in such a moment, but it stemmed a good part of the harm. The federal safety net programs worked overtime and made a significant impact improving life conditions of families living in and near poverty, helping families stay out of poverty, and I would highlight the increasing effectiveness of Social Security, unemployment insurance, the EITC, SNAP, in supporting working families' well-being during this period, and also in limiting the harm of so much instability during the downturn. With the economy's recovery growing stronger in recent years, the administration is making the push to take on reducing inequality through investments in education, improving the opportunities, improving job market opportunities, and setting up the economy for greater economic growth. A couple of the major efforts that the president is pushing is in the upcoming year is raise of the federal minimum wage, to raise the floor on earnings so that a hardworking American can earn a more decent living and move further towards achieving greater self-sufficiency and promote economic growth as well. That is probably the most immediate, short-term effort one could make to lift self-sufficiency for workers, for parents. More than a quarter of those who would be affected are parents, and a majority of those are mothers. Another major initiative the president has proposed to address long-term economic inequality has been investments in preschool education through the Early Learning Initiative, which I'm happy to say, while it did not get the full request that the president had put in his president's budget, was included, elements of it were included in the recent appropriations by Congress. Thanks.
Great, thanks, AJ. As Bob joins us at the podium, Bob's work will describe some of the early findings of a study around family self-sufficiency here in the state of Illinois.
I think what we'll mention is really come up with some of the preliminary findings we've had. Our intent is really to study low-income families since the year 2000. Since 2000, the U.S. poverty rate, and the Russell Sage Foundation actually came out with an RFP just yesterday, and they say it a little bit better than I could. Since 2000, the U.S. poverty rate has increased and the poor have become poorer, along with hardships brought on by the Great Recession, welfare reform, and prison boom, the rise in short-term and long-wage jobs, political decisions at the federal level, declines in union membership, and the high rates of joblessness have all contributed to deepening poverty in America. At the same time, poor families saw their incomes drop or stagnate. Their cost of housing rose substantially. Median asking monthly rent for vacant units has increased by more than 70% since 1990. At the same time, fewer new households were receiving government assistance. Cash assistance caseloads have fallen from 12.3 million recipients per month in 1996 to 4.5 million in 2011. Today, only 1 in 10 adults living below the poverty line receives cash welfare. On the other hand, some federal programs have grown substantially over the last 2 decades, namely EITC and Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. Large-scale changes in federal poverty policy have created new winners and losers. Some low-income families now fare much better, others fare much worse. So as resources at the federal, state, county, and city levels become more scarce relative to social anti-poverty programs, we need to be much clearer about the subpopulations of vulnerable families that have very different characteristics and therefore need different interventions and programs to address them. SNAP benefits were decreased last year. Many human service programs have taken cuts in Illinois and many other states, and additional cuts loom. The government and research community has a tremendous challenge in identifying different groups of households and families because of the long list of characteristics they have that might speak to their current status, but also what they're relying on to meet their daily needs. Improving self-sufficiency means different things or different groups of households. So we have to identify those subpopulations because there are different programs and interventions that those households will need. So this work is supported by the Ford Foundation, and we're working very closely with the Illinois Department of Human Services, particularly Linda Satterfield, who's the director of the Division of Family and Community Services. Vladimir Zanoni, Nick Mader, John Dilst, Nyla Barnes, and Kelly Crane, colleagues of mine at Chapin Hall, worked with me on this particular project. In the findings that I'm going to present today, I'll focus on the poorest part of the population. Our plan is to look at the poorest households from 2000 to the present in Illinois. We don't have all the data on families even in 2012 yet that we wanted to look at, but we're updating that information now and should have that report out within the next 6 months. There are about 1.8 million people in poverty now in Illinois, and there are about 2 million individuals in the SNAP program. There are clearly some SNAP households that who live above the poverty line, but it's a good starting point for understanding the poor and issues of self-sufficiency and the programs available to various subgroups of them. So I'm going to focus on families with children, and today I'm going to talk about our work on families with young children under the age of 5. We include families statewide from urban, suburban, and rural areas. But it turns out, actually, that these families look very similar across these different geographic regions relative to their use of SNAP, TANF, Medicaid, child care subsidies. They look similar relative to earning wages and how they transition off and on these programs over a number of years. We look at 2004. We picked 2004 to present today because it was a stable year and actually a year in which we started seeing increases in the SNAP population, larger increases. So in that year we had about 500,000 SNAP cases. Now we have 1 million SNAP cases. We're going to be very interested in looking at what happens as a result of the Great Recession and what happens to those families. There were about 500,000 individuals added to the SNAP rolls during the Great Recession, and looking at what happens to them as the economy improves is going to be very interesting. So what I'm going to present now is really to look at a cross-section of families who were on SNAP during 2004 and what they participated in the year before 2004, so 2003, and in 2005, the year after. What we do is we use a clustering analysis. So what we want to identify is a small group of, small number of groups of families so that we can really give them a name and know how many there are, and then talk about what type of interventions and programs might address their needs and what of the whole array of both federal and state programs apply to those families. I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the statistical procedures, but we use what's called latent class analysis, which identifies a relatively small number of households which have very similar characteristics. And the goal is really to come up with a small number of classes, as I said, that reflects our intuition as much as it can about what these families need and what their progression through the system is. So what I'm going to talk about is, again, their use of TANF, food stamps, Medicaid, child care subsidies, and their earnings before 2004, after 2004, and then look at their transitions as a way of describing these groups. So we come up with 5 groups, and the biggest group is the zero income group. It's 38% of all SNAP cases, and 3/4 of them were on SNAP the year before, and 3/4 of them were on the year after. All of these individuals in the household, all of these cases have individuals in the household that receive Medicaid. Few of these cases are using child care subsidies in 2003, 2004, 2005. If they are, they may be using them for training or education purposes. Most of these households have no wages from formal employers, and none of these cases were on TANF in 2003 or 2004. So since they have zero formal income, something like EITC or tax credits is really not an issue for them. The second group is about 27% of all SNAP households. I call these kind of the strivers with income. Unlike the class above, these households have income, an average of $10,000 the year before and $10,000 2004 and $1,000 the year after. Nearly half of these households are using a child care subsidy, but there is also a great deal of change from using a subsidy from year to year, as child care subsidy use is sometimes has very short durations, and people are on and off of that group. So this is a group that uses child care subsidies a lot. 85% of these families were on SNAP the year before 2004, but they dropped tremendously in 2005 as only 74% remained on. Again, 100% of these households have some participation in the Medicaid program during 2004, but that also decreases in 2005 to 85%. Some of these cases are on TANF, but relatively few, and they move off of TANF in 2005. The third group is about 20% of all cases, and they're the new SNAP cases. They're new in 2004. They weren't on SNAP the year before. They're a brand new case, and they're relatively stable. Stable in the sense that they haven't increased their income at all. They actually have very little income, and only about 15% of these families have earnings in 2003, 2004, and 2005. And they're not using the child care subsidy at all. The fourth case is a small, we're getting smaller now as we get down the list, 11% of all SNAP cases, and they are the TANF cases. And about 30% of these cases who are on TANF in 2004 are off in 2005. So again, there's a lot of movement. About a quarter of these cases are using child care subsidies. And although very few have employment in this group, it's likely, again, that they may be using TANF to, they may be in training programs or education programs, which is why they might be eligible for child care subsidies. This is the only group that has a geographic overrepresentation. Most of these cases are in Chicago, so we see most of the TANF cases were in Chicago. The last group is very small in 2004, but I expect that this group will increase tremendously as we get into the Great Recession and beyond it. It's only 4% of the group, but they're, again, new SNAP cases in 2004. They did not participate in SNAP or Medicaid the year before 2004. And 1/3 of this class has at least one member employed. So there's somebody still working, and their income is around $4,000 per year. So these are also strivers, although their income is not as great. But they are using child care subsidies as much as the striver cases. So there is more hope for this group to increase their income and perhaps use fewer support programs and to get off of SNAP. So in our future work, we want to add WIC and workforce development to this analysis, so we understand how many families might be in workforce development programs, either in WIA or TANF or SNAP. WIC is also an important support, especially for this group of families with children under 5. So in summary, we have these two groups, one with income and one number of groups with no income, and a couple of groups with a fair amount of income. So you'd see you would have to address these groups very differently. For those without income, the issue is really job development, training, especially I think with adolescents and young adults to try to get them into the workforce. Those with income is just trying to give them the supports. And as AJ said, getting them to use EITC because of the great effect that has on improving their economic well-being. And of course, and we're a very different place than we are in terms of health insurance than in 2004. Maintaining their health insurance is very important, and we expect that most of these groups will be using Medicaid a lot more as we go from 2004 to the present. So we'll be updating this work through 2012 very soon, so we can look at the dynamics of the group of the families that went through the Great Recession, and hopefully within the next 6 months we'll have a report available to talk about that.
Morning. Thank you to the organizers at Chapin Hall for putting together a forum on this very important and timely topic. My research focuses on understanding how economic instability affects families and children. And so today I want to summarize first some research evidence on 2 key points that I think overlap with and build on several of the things that AJ and Bob have already mentioned. The first point is that economic instability has increased for low-income families in the last 30 years. And the second point is that economic instability puts children at risk in specific ways that we are learning more about. So after making these points, then I want to talk about a few ideas that I have as a starting point for our discussion of how we might strengthen the safety net's ability to promote stability and self-sufficiency. So the first point, that we are increasingly seeing evidence that economic instability has increased for low-income families in the last 30 years. Research has traditionally treated family income as unchanging by using point-in-time or average income, for example. But we've long known from qualitative studies and administrative records that economic circumstances are actually highly dynamic, especially for low-income families. It is quite common for families to experience large fluctuations in income between years or even within a given year, and to move above and below the poverty line multiple times during a child's life. Safety net programs are actually more likely than research to capture these types of changes because employment and income is reported at regular intervals for the purposes of determining eligibility and setting benefit levels. But those safety net programs rarely acknowledge, or the design of those programs rarely acknowledge, that a family that moves above eligibility limits in a given quarter or month is less likely to be experiencing a permanent improvement or the start of an upward trajectory, and much more likely to just be on the roller coaster of ongoing income instability. Recent research studies have focused on understanding the dynamic nature of earnings and family income, and they suggest quite clearly that earnings and income volatility have increased in the past 30 years, particularly in the 1980s and then again in the first decade of the 2000s. And it's important to note that these are not changes that are just cyclical related to the recessions experienced, for instance, in the 2000s, but instead are structural changes in the economy. We don't know all the reasons for the greater instability, but it appears that they are partially the result of combined changes in the jobs that are available to less skilled workers and to changes to the design of our safety net. I'll talk about each in turn. So first, the jobs available to less educated workers have become less stable in numerous ways. There have been increases in the prevalence of non-standard work arrangements, such as contingent and temporary positions, increases in non-standard work hours and inconsistent schedules or shifts, increases in part-time work among workers who are seeking full-time hours, and decreases in the provision of benefits in low-skilled jobs. The increase in employment instability has been felt in various ways across the education distribution, but the brunt of these changes fall on the most disadvantaged workers, the least educated workers. And this does not even scratch the surface of the instability that's faced by those in informal or unregulated labor markets. At the same time that these changes were happening to the low-wage labor market, the safety net was also becoming more employment-based, more connected to work. With welfare reform, the expansions of the EITC, the push for work requirements for certain populations receiving food stamps, and other changes, much of public assistance is now contingent on employment. A greater number of programs and a greater proportion of safety net spending is directed to working individuals than ever before. Together, these changes, I would argue, are potentially a double whammy for less skilled workers. They are both less stable in their jobs and finding less stable support from the safety net. Important questions need to be answered by researchers and policymakers about how well our safety net promotes employment and stability, and these questions were raised already by AJ and Bob, and what it does to buffer families against the realities of the low-wage labor market. My second main point is that these questions are fundamentally important because economic instability puts children at risk. We know from decades of research that poverty experienced in childhood is associated with a wide range of poor outcomes, not only in childhood, but throughout the lifespan. Recently, we have increasing evidence that economic instability might have distinct and important adverse effects on child development, and AJ referenced a nice synthesis of this literature by Heather Sandstrom at the Urban Institute. Very generally, the idea that children benefit from stable context is fundamental to our understanding of child development. Children develop in the context of interactions with people and objects in their environments. Healthy development relies on the regularity and consistency of those interactions. We know, for instance, that changes to who cares for a child, to where they attend school, or to where they live can be temporarily disruptive to development. But more importantly, there is increasing evidence that repeated changes to children's environments can cause not only stress for the child, but can actually fundamentally alter the body's stress response system. These physiological changes are increasingly thought to have long-run consequences for health and development. More specifically to economic instability, a specific type of instability, changes in parental employment and family income might disrupt children's environments in two specific ways. Economic instability could cause greater stress for parents, which is associated with lower quality parenting practices, and economic instability could cause specific material hardships, such as hunger, or changes in how much parents can invest in their children, specifically in their children's education. So for these reasons, I would argue that addressing the increase in economic instability for low-income families is fundamental to promoting self-sufficiency and to protecting children from the effects of poverty and inequality. So this leads me to three ideas to get us thinking about improving the safety net's ability to promote stability and self-sufficiency. First, I think we could maintain a better balance of work-based and non-work-based assistance. Some assistance should not be predicated on employment. This is important for some individuals who Bob was mentioning who really aren't working at any given point in time. But I actually would argue it's far more important for the vast majority of low-wage workers who face periods of unemployment or unpredictable hours and earnings. In recent years, many social policies have been redesigned, as I mentioned, to provide supports primarily to workers. At the moment, SNAP and other food programs are the primary assistance programs that we have that are not predicated on employment. And the funding for these programs has been threatened recently. This was not always our approach to the safety net. Early social policy in the U.S. emphasized supporting those who could not earn enough by working. Given the high degree of instability in the low-wage labor market, perhaps we can arrive at a balance of programs that promote and support work with programs that provide for basic needs when work earnings do not. Or perhaps even better, we might create tiers of support within individual programs so that assistance is more stable and supportive as workers experience employment instability. And I think importantly, this approach would help protect children from the disruptions associated with their parents' unstable work. The second idea I would raise is whether we could better promote job-specific education and training and job matching. We have largely moved to what's called a work-first approach in our workforce development system and in TANF, which served many workers, I think, quite well in the 1990s, particularly in combination with the increase in work supports that were available. However, as I stated earlier, there has been a decline in the quality and stability of the jobs available to less educated workers. So simply placing workers in the available jobs is no longer a sufficient intervention if we want to promote stability and self-sufficiency. Harry Holzer at Georgetown writes extensively on approaches that are more promising. They include job-specific education and training, workforce development approaches that focus on sector or industry-specific job training and job matching. A lot could be done, I would argue, some of it without increasing funding, to change the rules of both TANF and WIA to allow for these types of approaches. Third, and finally, we could make work-based programs more flexible to the instability of low-wage work. Currently, relatively small and potentially temporary changes in employment and earnings can cause drastic and long-lasting changes in the receipt of public assistance. A good example of this that's already come up in several of the presentations is that for a mother who's working and receiving child care subsidies, unstable employment, movements in and out of jobs, may result in the loss of child care subsidies and difficulties getting child care subsidies again when she needs it. In fact, she may still need it even when she's not working, right? This can be quite a large hit to the overall family economic circumstances and make it difficult for parents to stay employed. This occurs, these changes, these drastic changes occur because of a combination of sharp income eligibility cliffs in our programs, short recertification periods, and sometimes heavy administrative burden for reapplication or for moving between programs. This is particularly a problem for families who are at the margins of eligibility for specific programs, who are right below or above the eligibility lines. The problem is that the eligibility lines are at different places for different programs. So families could be hit by major changes in the assistance they're receiving repeatedly as they try to move up the economic ladder from poverty to self-sufficiency. So we could make our system more flexible. We could create more flexibility for families to use the safety net to get ahead economically by lengthening recertifications, by reducing the rates at which you lose benefits as your earnings increase, and by reducing administrative hurdles to application and to moving between programs. Thank you.
So we will now move into the question and answer period. We would encourage folks who are in the room to use a mic so that the entire room, as well as folks online, can hear the questions. But we'll also take questions from our online participants. So to kick the Q&A off, I thought I would just take the first question and go to AJ and ask, given the limited degree to which all families would meet the standard of self-sufficiency, or broadly the sense that there's a limited need for government support, is it that, given that low percentage of families who would meet that definition, are there other outcomes besides self-sufficiency that we should be focused on when we think about the safety net, both at the federal level as well as at the state level?
Sure. Sure. So first let me say, while I want to point out the practicality of looking at self-sufficiency as a measure of progress, I do want to say that self-sufficiency is in fact an important goal, right? We want families to be self-sufficient and to be getting closer to it, particularly over time. And, you know, we are a people who believe in the value of work, of being able to provide for one's own living, one's family's living. We're also people who share communitarian values of setting a floor under which we don't want to see families, particularly families with children, fall. So what I would probably argue is that self-sufficiency is is a good goal and it's a good lens, but it's being defined as an either or. Are you self-sufficient or are you not? And it's being used more for political rhetoric to sort of define the limits of what government can and should do. What I would probably suggest is that we work more on looking at self-sufficiency as a continuum. That would sort of imply to what degree are families able to be self-sufficient? How they are working, so how much of their needs are they able to meet through low and moderate wage work alone? How do we I mean, I think what that would provide, and also looking at it longitudinally, to what degree are we seeing progress over time? We would expect and want that if self-sufficiency is in fact a goal, that families are becoming more self-sufficient with more labor market participation. And I don't think we even know very well whether that's the case. The other thing that using self-sufficiency, in fact, as a barometer, but not as a dichotomous view, would allow us to see, does our safety net reward progress? Does it reward striving families? Does it balance out, I mean, it also might serve a very valid goal of balancing out the family's ability to meet their needs. But I don't think we fully know what that is. I would also argue that we've made some progress in how we view families with looking at poverty through the SPM. I mean, the SPM, this supplemental poverty measure, really does give us a better picture of what these combined resources do. It's in fact, in its premise, it sort of recognizes that families rely on a multitude of supports and earnings to sort of get by. And then, to the question of, if self-sufficiency alone isn't the right measure, what should we be looking at to look at sort of vulnerabilities among families? I mean, I would argue that, both poverty and self-sufficiency are good lenses, but we really, at the end of the day, we really want to know, are children more food insecure? Those are facts that people know a lot less. Are we seeing more distress and severe distress in families? Those are measures like family and youth homelessness, and cases that are going into the child welfare system. I mean, again, I want to sort of raise up what the effects of the American Recovery Act did to sort of mitigate harm. I think many of us who were analysts looking back at 2007, thought food insecurity was going to go through the roof, right? We were worried about huge increases in family homelessness, of many more overburdened child welfare systems. I think one of the things that the safety net supports in that period did, I mean, if you can actually see it, is food insecurity was climbing dramatically in 2007 and 2008 for children. And what the ERA benefits did is it continued to go, but it reduced the rate and it basically kept it pretty flat over that period. We also see that in some of the other more distressed measures. I think those are important to put next to these sort of, are you above or below the line? Are you self-sufficient or are you not? Is what is happening there? And then I guess the other area that I would sort of encourage policy and research to focus on is in fact instability, right? We don't have any sort of cumulative measure of what instability looks like across these domains. It's frightening when you think about the high degree of instability in all these domains and how much they trigger one another. So we've talked about child care instability and how that can be affected by employment and vice versa. But housing instability and family composition instability is also greatly unstable, and one of the being evicted or losing your apartment generally does lead to a broad trigger on these other domains. It's deeply unsettling, and I think those are also something that we need to sort of measure a little bit more. And then finally, along that line, there's a lot of churning through programs, right? That seems, when you look at the broader view of self-sufficiency and the idea that families combine work and supports, it seems like it's counterproductive, because the families at multiple continuous points in time are in need of assistance. But we make them go through hoops. We don't do that for Social Security, let's say. We know that the elderly it's a system that we pay into, but at the same time, we sort of know that we don't burden families to renew their Social Security or to show or other services, because we know it's an ongoing need. It may fluctuate in the amount of need, but it is an ongoing need. And so I think that there is more churning through these systems that in fact add to the instability in families and kids. So I think that's not a crisp answer, but it's a multitude of things that we should look at.
So Bob and Heather, weigh in on this question of instability and the extent to which safety net programs ought to have stability as an explicit goal of the policy itself.
So I think that we should have stability as a goal for our safety net. I think we have some work to do to think about what that would mean. Our safety net at the moment is predicated on, I think, three main goals. One is providing some basic needs, protecting families' basic needs. The second is promoting work and self-sufficiency as an extension of that. And the third is reducing or limiting the cost to taxpayers of the system. So then the question is, if you bring stability in as an additional goal, and maybe even not stability, but not just stability, but also mobility, trying to actually improve families' economic circumstances over time, how does that interact with those other goals? Can you make policy that would promote all of those things? It's likely that in some cases, promoting stability would also benefit some of those other goals, like protecting basic needs. But in other cases, for instance, we might, to be able to promote stability, we might have to back a little bit away from promoting work as the primary way of families supporting themselves. So I think it's a great idea to start thinking about stability and mobility, but there's some work to do to understand what that would mean in practice.
So let me push you a little bit on that one.
Yeah.
Right? I think part of what each of the three panelists documented was that self-sufficiency in and of itself is a misnomer.
Absolutely.
For which there is limited measure of progress towards it. Right? So why privilege an inaccurate description of what happens? Mm-hmm. Continue to focus on stability. Continue to focus on self-sufficiency, mm-hmm. and instead privilege stability while needing to be defined. Mm-hmm. Just as much work could be put into self-sufficiency. Given how one might be able to achieve either of those goals. Why wouldn't we, or why shouldn't we entertain moving away from self-sufficiency as a goal?
Well, I am all for that. But I think there are two concerns about self-sufficiency as a goal that are worth distinguishing. One is whether it should be the goal. That is, it's more of a philosophical question of whether our system should be about getting people off, the safety net system should be about getting people off the safety net, right? That's more about how you sort of think of the role of government in reducing poverty and inequality. The second issue around self-sufficiency that's problematic, that AJ did a really nice job of describing, is that our programs really aren't designed to promote self-sufficiency. That's not really, we're not working that effectively to get people into jobs that have ladders for advancement and opportunities for wage growth. I mean, that's just not been our focus. So we have both the problem of whether we think it's the right goal and whether our programs are accomplishing it, right? So then if, as Brian suggests, if we apply that same thing to stability, I think stability, again, would have, there'd be political and philosophical concerns about whether our government should be primarily focused on stability. Is that the right goal for government programs? And then there'd be the secondary question of, if so, how should our programs promote stability? What would they need? How would they need to change? And my statement was one that earlier was that many of the things you would do to promote stability, in my opinion, which I think we should do, would be about requiring participants. I think AJ's example of Social Security is great, actually. It would be about requiring recipients to recertify less often, to prove that their income or earnings are still below the level less often, right? It'd be about having transitional benefits that come with you as your circumstances change. And these are things that will lead to perhaps less of a focus on work promotion, less of a focus on reducing fraud or just the receipt of assistance by people who aren't strictly below the eligibility limits at a given time. So that was my main point, was that we would have to be willing as a society, as you know, to walk away from some of what we've focused on in the last 20 years, I would say, in order to promote stability.
Yeah, great.
You know, the flip side to stability and what Heather just mentioned in terms of scaling back some of the requirements is that I would want them, I would concerned about parents making sure their children go to school. I want to make sure that parents make sure their children are getting health care, and you mentioned some of these things. What, you know, how does kind of taking some of the pressure off lead to changes in parenting? I mean, I use stable in my classifications as not necessarily a good thing. So stable how? Stable at a level where we can ensure the well-being of children and the future self-sufficiency of those children. So it may not work for kind of a point in time, the idea of self-sufficiency and stability might be a better idea. But for the future well-being of children and even the young adults, so many of the heads of households that we looked at were in their mid-20s. What can we do about maintain that stability, but also encourage them to achieve things that will lead to greater employment, greater skills, and future increased well-being?
Great, thanks. Questions from the audience?
Yeah, I didn't hear a lot about, thank you. I didn't hear a lot about healthcare as one of the factors, and with the expansion of Medicaid, you know, and the impact that that's going to have on the overall stability or poverty rates. But in particular, when the person reaches the place where they're no longer eligible for Medicaid and under the Affordable Care Act, they then go on some kind of subsidized care, that could be a destabilizing experience for people in that strata. But I didn't hear a lot about what healthcare, what role healthcare plays in the whole question of stability.
This is a very, very good question, and it plays a really important role, because if you think about what the implications are of the loss of healthcare insurance to a parent or child, the costs, the increase in costs, in medical costs for that family could be quite substantial, right? So being above or below the threshold for health insurance programs is in some ways the most extreme case of how things can change really dramatically. I think we've made some real steps towards promoting stability for children's health insurance coverage. We've done that by expanding Medicaid in part, but largely through the Children's Health Insurance Program, and making sure that as parents work more, have higher earnings, move up the economic ladder, that's not going to, it'll be a long while before that has drastic effects on children's health insurance coverage. And we also know quite a bit about the fact that gaps in health insurance coverage have real implications for preventive health care and for health outcomes. So I think we could still do more to look at, for instance, what causes children, even with CHIP, what causes children to fall off of Medicaid or CHIP, and how could we eliminate those sorts of gaps. And the expansions that are happening right now in Medicaid will, I think, mostly expand Medicaid to a group of people who did not have it before, which are single low-income adults without children. And that's a very important support given the changes in employment that I mentioned earlier. So I think that the Affordable Care Act is definitely promoting stability for health insurance in the way that we would want it to. But I still think there's work that could be done looking at why people move in and out of these programs and how we can work better to create a stable support for families.
I'll just build a couple of things on that. I totally agree. I think compared to other safety net programs, and I do consider health insurance a safety net program, it's just not, I don't believe in converting it to a dollar value, so that's why it's not shown up in there. In fact, compared to some of the other benefit programs, it is more, there's less churning through recertification and others, particularly compared to something like child care benefits or TANF, and it's especially true for children. I think one of the things that the Medicaid expansions for adults does is it means there's more overall stability in families. There are still lots of I do think that single adults are the largest beneficiary of that, but there are a lot of cases where parents are on CHIP, where children are on CHIP and parents are uninsured. There's hopefully less of that. I think a potential new area of instability is at least not between uninsured and public insurance. There may be some issue around the seams that could be created around where one is in Medicaid and one is getting subsidized on the exchanges. And time will tell how that gets managed. Hopefully the exchanges will figure that out. But I think at least it'll be more about maintaining insurance across systems that for which you're eligible, as opposed to falling off and being uninsured altogether.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the seam issue too, but I also want to bring up the issue of now that people have their health benefits, how are they using them? Are they getting the preventative care they need, or are they still behaving in a way that they're using emergency rooms and other, and there's certainly that push towards having a medical home and a primary physician and all that kind of stuff. But hopefully that works because it really the health, preventative health care and having regular care is really the what we're hoping will reduce some of the medical costs for the country.
So we have a question from an online participant who would like to know your thoughts related to the role of higher education in promoting self-sufficiency and stability. And are there policies or rethinking of policy on the higher ed side that might also contribute to greater prospects for self-sufficiency, stability, and even economic mobility?
I'll just make a couple of points, and like I said, self-sufficiency is a goal. It's something that we would want to aspire more families being able to reach and more families being able to provide for a greater share of their family's needs. The clearest ticket to that is clearly, strong post-secondary education, right, and higher education. So the highest correlation with that largest group that I had over there, families where families make over $70,000 or more and have much lower use of safety net programs, they still get support from government from a lot of other tax benefits and other programs, is having access to higher education. It's still the form of mobility for the country. So we do want to sort of figure out, and those are some of the things that Heather raised, how do we promote greater human capital development early so that families are either begin on a pathway of begin largely self-sufficient or are on a pathway towards self-sufficiency early on.
I do think higher education is an important component of social mobility. We've done a really good job of expanding access to higher education over time in this country. And the concern we're seeing now is many students who come from more disadvantaged background, maybe are first-generation college goers, start college but aren't finishing, often due to financial instability. So I think the way I would think about this question is that we want to think about how, even from early on in childhood, how the parents' employment stability and their financial stability overall affects their ability to save, their ability to build assets, to plan for college going, and to give their children the opportunities in school that will allow them to be successful later in college. So I think it's an important component, but I also think it's worth saying that we put much less money and much less effort into workforce development for those workers who only have a high school diploma or less. And that I think is in some ways more important, at least this is obviously just my perspective, at this point in terms of thinking about inequality in this country and in terms of thinking about instability, because it is so fundamentally important right now that we offer opportunities for workers to gain the skills they'll need to get better jobs, more stable jobs, better paying jobs, jobs that have opportunities for advancement. So I would like to see more of a focus at that level. And I should say there's a very mixed research evidence base on adult job training and workforce development. So we need to do more to understand what works, and as to Bob's point about for different groups, what works for different groups.
Other questions in the audience here?
My question is somewhat related to that question, and if there's anything being done to with TANF to make post-secondary education or training programs eligible in terms of the federal participation rate for adults that receive TANF.
Mm-hmm.
And also the two-generation programs that kind of look at the low-income parent, who is sometimes the mother, and actually provides the services for the parent. And it's really a two-generation program because so goes the parent, so goes the child.
I think there's a huge issue around those parents being, well, not just parents, but kids coming out of high school being ready for post-secondary education. Even the percentage of students that are ready for taking college courses at UIC here is about half that aren't remedial courses. And we know that city colleges also have a high percentage of kids who have to take remedial classes before they can take college credit classes. So the issue again falls back to high schools, and I think there is more work now around college preparation, preparing kids to be successful in college. But what are we doing to support adults being successful when they go back to post-secondary? I think that's your question. I don't know how much is being done around that. It doesn't seem to me like there is a lot being done.
No type of education is, if I'm not mistaken, counted as far as the federal participation rate for adults that receive TANF. So in terms of some of the job matching, the sector industry matching that you spoke of, even if it was an opportunity for that TANF adult to get in some type of program, it would not count in terms of the federal participation rate.
Right.
So you're speaking to exactly the point I was making, which is that there are some things we could do that aren't necessarily about spending more money, but that are about changing rules to support these kinds of approaches. The rules around what's allowed to count for TANF vary. Well, there's the federal participation rates, and then there's some variation across states, right? But it is true that in general, TANF is not designed to provide assistance for people to get additional education and training. And again, this is an example of what Brian was asking me about earlier. This is where our system has really been designed to promote work first over other approaches to improving family economic circumstances. And so we would need to, if we wanted to promote instead mobility or some economic stability that leads to mobility, we would need to rethink that. It is important to say that TANF at this point is a relatively small program in terms of how many people it's serving. So I think it might be a good place to start, but in some ways I think the WIA program combined with TANF and perhaps other programs, we want to think beyond TANF, I guess is what I'm saying.
So Bob, we have a question here that you might want to weigh in on, which is we have an online question related to the intersection between poverty and child welfare, and specifically the extent to which rates of poverty explain the disproportionate representation of African Americans in foster care.
Well, I think there's certainly that's disproportionality there, but it's I tend not to make that connection between poverty and poor parenting, although even with disproportionality, because it's in more and more work we find that really there are issues of health issues, of substance abuse, mental health, that lead to those kids going into child welfare. It's not being poor, still a relatively small percentage of those poor families have issues relative to parenting. I think the question is how much is the child welfare system just part of African American geographic areas, communities, and not part of Latino or white areas. I don't want to make that connection. I would prefer to say that there are issues. When we look at the effect of race or ethnicity on outcomes relative to the child welfare system, either entering the child welfare system or leaving the child welfare system, the more we look at the characteristics of parents and not their race and ethnicity, the more we can explain those outcomes, and the race and ethnicity effect tends to go away.
So I think your point is well taken. Certainly, there are some studies that would suggest that there is an important interaction between living in a poor neighborhood and an increased likelihood for being reported to child welfare. So there's certainly a body of literature that speaks to that issue. But to Bob's point, one of the more interesting changes over time has been that if you look at child welfare over the last 15 years, there's been about a 27% reduction in the size overall. However, African American children represent about 75% of the total reduction. So in 1997, there were 240,000 children in the foster care system who were African American. Today, there are 120,000. So that number has been cut in half in a time where there's limited evidence that rates of poverty have changed much at all. So that there is certainly support for looking at the issue beyond poverty to explain the presence of African Americans, given that poverty hasn't gone down greatly, but there's been a significant shift in the size of the child welfare population. Other questions here in the room?
So this is sort of speaking to Professor Hill's commentary about flexibility in the system. Doing anti-poverty advocacy the last few months, especially with now cuts in unemployment benefits and the elimination of, ERA support, even though the economy hasn't changed. I'm wondering if you could speak to the idea of linking economic reality to types of benefits and the structure of benefits, and how that could also decrease just levels of instability.
Before you give the microphone away, could you say, do you mean linking it for a an argument politically for why we should change things, or do you mean linking it in the context of research? Could you say a little bit more about?
I think more like it in legal structure, that linking, I mean, what happens with sort of the conservative perspective is that this is a self-sufficiency issue, and it makes it more difficult to look at economic reality surrounding cuts to benefits and structures for benefits. And if there's a way for people like you to make recommendations about building in considerations about economic realities to the way benefits are changed or cut.
That's a great question, but a tough one. I mentioned the idea that is not particularly well formed, but I think we need to think about within a given program that may be overall designed to promote work and self-sufficiency, whether there are ways to, as I said before, build tiers of assistance in that would acknowledge the fact that families' economic circumstances are not generally stable when we're talking about low-income families, and that you want assistance to be available assistance be available longer and through a variety of different circumstances, but decrease pretty gently. And one of my colleagues describes this as providing a smooth landing, where the landing is at self-sufficiency perhaps, or a higher economic status. So food stamps is actually a pretty good example of this kind of design. Not of the tiers so much, but of the idea that food stamp benefits decline very gently as your earnings increase. There's no direct connection for most people in receiving food stamps with employment. So it's just as your income's going up, food stamps, you can imagine sort of a very gentle slope, to the point that those who are receiving food stamps at sort of the highest income eligibility levels are receiving very little, right? It's not actually helping their overall budget that much, but that's okay because it's providing that smooth landing. When they go over that line, they will not experience a huge decrease in their assistance. So if that makes sense, I think that's a specific way of thinking about how we might tier supports and make the supports decrease more gently. This will mean providing supports to families at higher incomes, right? Which is both more costly and perhaps not politically very appetizing for some. But it will also mean that the system is acknowledging those realities of instability and acknowledging that you don't want to contribute to the instability by cutting off assistance right when families are actually seeing an improvement in their work earnings. There's really good research, by the way, from Jen Romick at the University of Washington about how sharp these drops can be, that literally getting a raise at work or getting an additional 10 hours can lead to having less income overall for low-income families. That seems to me to be a structure that isn't promoting self-sufficiency or stability in the way that we would want to.
I just want to echo that point, especially in the chart that I showed in terms of median overall total benefits across the safety net programs. You see that the decline is really sharp, that the cumulative effect of many of these benefits, particularly in the area above 100% of poverty and below 250%, let's say, so between about $25,000 and $60,000 a year, can be very sharp. When you add up where the EITC phases out, where you add up what the SNAP ending and other benefits. So like I said, a goal should be, if we're taking self-sufficiency as a continuum, a goal should be to reward progress and to decrease instability. That effect actually has, as Heather's pointing out, the opposite effect. And so I think thinking across programs and the combinations of programs families generally receive, the two largest safety net supports that working families rely on in combination are EITC and SNAP. So and that's in a large ways the bulk of the supports that families get that raises many families, millions of families out of poverty or improves their life conditions while working in low income. I think thinking, just there, how do we sort of smooth out that sort of transition? And I think that's right, that it's, particularly in it's the working families in the income group that's, still struggling that we need to sort of think about that.
I heard your question a little different, and if I'm wrong, I'm still going to say what I'm going to say. So how states respond to the economy has varied tremendously. I don't know if some of you have looked at the New York Times and the comparison they've made between Wisconsin and Minnesota and how they address the issues of everything from generating jobs to unions to the poor quite differently. And Illinois might not be the best example, but as the economy gets worse, they're cutting the budget for poor people even more. Of course, that has to do with pensions and all that types of issues too, so it's different. But there are some states that have stepped up and addressed, the economic problems that are occurring at the federal level. So states can do things very differently and have different impacts on different subpopulations. Again, different populations depending on the decisions they make. And I think we're right now in this kind of natural experiment to see how states are responding to the Great Recession and the continuing increasing income divide and what will happen as a result of their particular policies and how they implement new laws and new regulations and so forth.
Great, thanks, Bob. Bob will have to have the last word. We have reached our time limit. So I'd like to certainly thank all of the folks in the audience, as well as those who have joined us online. And I'd ask the folks in the room to give a thanks to Bob and AJ and Heather and their contribution to this discussion. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you down the road. Take care.